Where would we be without the public sector? Well, there may be rude answers to that, but the reality is that the performance of the public sector and its implementation of policy and reform in particular can often make or sink a government. Bill Eggers is an international public sector guru based in the US and on a visit to Australia. His latest book, If We Can Put a Man on the Moon, is a new Bible for politicians, bureaucrats and the private sector alike. And he joins me now from Melbourne. Bill Eggers, welcome to Late Line Business.
It's great to be with you tonight, Kiki.
Why is there so often such a big gap between political promises and implementation of policies? Is it more over-promising or failure in the public sector?
Well, I think there's a little bit of both. What we always hear from politicians often is failure is not an option. But of course, we do know that failure is often an option. And the best way to avoid failure is actually to take failure seriously. So what we did in the book, we actually looked at 75 big initiatives since World War II. Everything from struggles of immigration reform, we looked at London congestion pricing, Japanese postal privatization, the Sydney Olympics. And we were trying to find a path to success. What's the difference between those initiatives that end in great triumphs and success and those that end in big failures and on the front page of the newspaper?
You're a great believer in innovation in the public sector as a key to success, and you promote things like social media, I know. But how do you foster or create innovation with risk-averse public servants?
Well, it's actually all about how you actually approach the notion of risk, because innovation requires experimentation. Experimentation requires actually failures. Some experiments fail. And so if we have a risk-averse culture where people are saying we're afraid to ever fail, you're not going to have innovation. But it's all about how do you actually fail. You want to fail fast and fail small. You want to do lots of prototyping, lots of testing, and you want to actually see how things work in the real world. Test them with real users, with real people, go out in the communities. And the more you fail fast and fail small, then you're going to actually be able to succeed better. What we find in the public sector is too often we fail at scale. Things get so big and they get too big to fail. And so essentially, by doing things smaller, prototyping and testing, then we could actually achieve more successes.
Let me ask you about some big reforms. Healthcare, which is both in the US and Australia, very much on the agenda. President Obama got some level of healthcare reform through, but nothing like what Hillary Clinton wanted to do several years ago. What are the lessons there?
Well, I think, look, healthcare represents a huge percentage of the economy, both in Australia and the United States. It's a very, very complex system involving the public sector, the private sector, GPs, and so forth. And so there's certain lessons when you look at implementation, which is the stage that you're in here in Australia and the United States will be in soon. First of all, you want to make sure to involve the people who are actually doing this in the process of, again, design and implementation. That's doctors and nurses and patients and others. Use things like social media, use Twitter and Facebook and others so you can actually get the pulse of them, see how they're really feeling as opposed to just people representing organizations. Secondly, again, before you roll out big, massive reforms, you want to do a lot of testing and prototyping and simulation and just see how these actually reforms work in the hospitals and with real patients before they're rolled out nationwide. And third, again, before you do the big implementations, you want to make sure that you've incrementally reduced your risk, but you want to make sure that you looked at all the different ways that this can fail, and you've tested and war-gamed all those things to avoid that sort of failure.
It's quite interesting because just today we hear that the clinicians in our healthcare reform may not actually be on the boards that was originally suggested. But having spent a couple of days in Australia, what do you think of our exasperated federal government needing to basically propose a takeover of state-run hospitals?
Well, I think the key thing, you mentioned the clinicians, I think the key thing is that for any of these sort of reforms to work, you actually need to reach all the way down to the people who are on the front lines, who are actually doing the work. You want to get ideas from them, you want to take their pulse, and you want to be able to iterate and change the policy reforms as they're going, depending on how they're working there. And you know what? Sometimes you're going to actually need to kill the different things off as they're working or as they're not working. And I think that's going to be the key to reform here. And basically, if a policy was established before, but it's not working, you have to be able to very, very quickly shut that down and try something new.
Another big area of reform for us in Australia is in infrastructure. Now, governments, state governments and federal governments have experimented with some investment. They've worked with the private sector in PPPs. Many have got their fingers burnt in this area. How do you think the private sector and the public sector can and should work together?
Well, first of all, Australia's been a worldwide leader in PPPs for 2 decades. Whether it's education PPPs, whether it's PPPs around road use and tunnels and bridges and so forth.
But very often you've got a bank like Macquarie Bank, who actually is perceived as very much getting the upper hand on the state government.
Well, again, I think the key thing here is that you're learning from what's working, what's not working. You're developing other models. You're learning from those successes and failures. I mean, when you look at the Cross-City Tunnel in Sydney, well, the public sector got a pretty good deal from that, right? And I think that's what you want to look at is what is the value that the citizens are getting, the public's getting, and by leveraging public dollars, you're able to actually build leveraging private dollars, you're actually able to build a lot more infrastructure than you would otherwise. And I mean, in fact, the United States is trying to learn a lot of lessons from Australia in terms of what you've done with PPPs over the last 20 years.
Bill Eggers, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining Late Line Business.
Thank you very much.